Wyoming Territory, July 12, 1877. The flood came fast and without warning, tearing through the valley like the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed everything she loved. Della Langford stood on the muddy ridge above what used to be her family's homestead, her dress clinging to her legs, her boots soaked heavy with water. Her father's barn was gone. The house, gone. The creek that used to trickle behind the chicken coop had turned into a roaring black river, and her family. They had been inside when it happened. She had screamed herself hoarse trying to reach them, her mother, her younger brother, even the old dog, but the current had been too strong. She had barely made it out herself, dragged up the hill by a neighbor's boy before the land gave way beneath her feet. Now she stood alone, trembling, her fingers tangled in her wet skirts as the wind howled across the ruined land. Her skin stung from flying debris, her heart cracked wide open. The sun dipped low over the mountains, casting long shadows over the wreckage. She should have gone with them to town that morning. She should have been there. She should have. Della! The voice cut through the wind like a shot. She turned, blinking the grit from her eyes. A man on horseback was galloping hard through the muddy road, his hat low, reins pulled tight. The moment he saw her, he kicked harder. The horse slid to a stop near her, breathing hard, its sides slick with sweat. "Della," the cowboy said again, urgent. His voice was warm, familiar. "Are you hurt?" She blinked again, recognizing him now. "Kade Hollis." Her voice cracked. She reached out, barely able to think. How did you?" "I heard about the flood early this morning." He was already off the horse, stepping through the mire. "Someone rode into Casper saying the Langford place was hit bad. I rode through the night." Her knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the ground. "I got you," he said softly, pulling her close. "I got you, Della." She buried her face in his chest, the smell of leather and horse and sweat somehow grounding her. His arms were solid around her, shaking a little from exhaustion. "I could not save them," she whispered. "They were in the house. I tried." "I know," he said, voice low. "I know." Kade had been a friend of her brother's years ago. He had helped bale hay one summer, and she remembered how he used to tip his hat at her and call her Miss Della, always grinning like he knew something she did not. He had left to work cattle farther west, and she had not seen him in almost 2 years. Until now. He helped her onto the horse, then climbed up behind her, steadying her as the sky turned purple with dusk. She leaned into him, her body numb, her hands gripping the saddle horn. "Where are we going?" she asked, voice small. "I got a place not far," he said. "Dry land, roof that holds. You can rest there." She nodded, too spent to argue. The ride was quiet, save for the sound of hooves in the wet earth and the wind rustling broken trees. Her body ached with every step the horse took, but she said nothing. Kade said nothing either. His hand was firm at her waist, steadying her. They reached his cabin just after nightfall. It sat up on a bluff safe from the flood. He helped her down, then led her inside, lighting a lantern that cast a soft glow across the wooden walls. It was small but clean: one bed, a stove, a water basin, a few shelves with simple food and books. "You can take the bed," he said, already shrugging off his coat and hanging it near the door. "I will stay on the floor." "I do not care where I sleep," she said, voice brittle. "I just want it to stop hurting." He stood still, watching her like he wished he could fix it all right there. "I know you do," he said, "but you are safe now." She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched in her lap. Her hair was matted, her dress ruined, her heart shattered. But she was alive, and he had come. He brought her a blanket and a clean shirt of his. "You should change. You are soaked through." She nodded, then turned her back while he stepped outside to give her privacy. When he came back in, she was curled on the bed, wearing his shirt, her damp dress folded near the stove. He stoked the fire and sat down near the hearth. "I do not know what I am supposed to do now," she said, staring at the ceiling. "You do not have to know that tonight," he said. "Just rest." She looked over at him. In the lantern glow, his jaw was sharp, his eyes tired but steady. "You rode all night just to find me?" she asked. "I did." "Why?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because I could not stand the thought of you out there alone. And because I care about you, Della. More than I ever said before." Her breath caught. She had not expected that. "Not tonight. Not ever, really." "I thought you forgot me," she whispered. "Never." She looked down at her hands. "I am not the same girl you knew." "I know," he said. "But I think you are stronger now, even if it does not feel like it yet." Silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It held something fragile and real. "Would you stay?" she asked. "Just until I fall asleep." He rose and crossed the room, pulling the chair closer to the bed. Then, without a word, he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers curled into his. She did not cry again, there were no more tears left. But she breathed slower, deeper, and she slept, with her hand still in his. The next morning came slow and gray, clouds stretching low over the hills like a damp wool blanket. The air held the hush that follows disaster, quiet not with peace, but with the weight of what had been lost. Inside the cabin, Della sat by the window wrapped in an old wool shawl, her fingers curled tight around a tin cup of warm coffee. She hadn't asked for it. Kade had just set it down beside her before tending to the fire again, the gesture wordless but not unnoticed. "Do you know if the road south's still passable?" she asked, her voice hoarse with sleep. He looked up from stoking the coals. "Might be, might not. Depends how far the water reached. I can ride out later, see what's left." She took a sip, the bitter heat grounding her. "I keep thinking maybe the flood missed the edge of the valley. Maybe the livestock scattered uphill." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "I saw your father's mule caught in a fence near the rise. Looked like it fought hard to stay upright." She folded the shawl tighter around herself. "You sure it was ours? Had your brother's red halter on?" She looked down at her hands. Dirt still clung beneath her fingernails. "He used to call that mule the most stubborn soul west of the Platte." Kade didn't smile, but a softness passed through his expression. He sank onto the bench near the hearth, stretching his legs out slow. His hat rested on the table beside him, the crown dented and still damp from the ride. "You gonna try to rebuild?" he asked after a moment. She shook her head. "No land to build on." Creek carved a new path through it, left nothing but silt and broken fence. He nodded once, no surprise in his eyes. "I could go to Cheyenne," she said. "There's an aunt there. Never met her, but she wrote Pa once after Ma passed the first time. Said if we ever needed anything." She trailed off, uncertain. "You could," Kate said. She looked over at him. "But," he ran a thumb along the edge of the bench. "That's a long ride for a woman on her own. Even longer if you don't know who's waitin' at the end." "I'm not helpless." "Didn't say you were." The silence between them stretched again, but not tense, just full. "You kept Pa's book?" she said, nodding toward the table where a worn leather journal lay. "He used to write down every tool bought, every weather change, even the names of calves born that spring." "Found it caught in a branch near the ridge," Kate said. "Didn't seem right to leave it floatin'." Her throat ached. "Thank you." He nodded. Outside, a wind stirred the trees, and a raven called once from the pines. The smell of damp earth drifted in through the open window. "After the water came through," she said slowly, "I remember feeling like the world had just turned inside out. Like everything I knew was gone, and the air wasn't even real anymore. Kade didn't look away. I reckon that feeling doesn't leave quick. She studied him. His eyes held that steady kind of care that didn't ask for anything in return. It made her feel less adrift, like maybe there was still something in the world that could hold. I didn't know if I wanted to wake up this morning, she said quietly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. But you did. I did. Neither of them moved. I got cattle to check on, he said finally. They're penned a few miles past the ridge. If you're feeling up to it, you could ride along. Get fresh air. Let your legs stretch. She hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that. He stood and reached for his coat. Good. I'll saddle the mare for you. When he stepped outside, she rose from the bench and walked to the table. Her father's journal sat where Kade had left it, still damp around the edges. She opened it to the last page, the ink blurred but still legible. June 23rd. Storm clouds building near the west. Della fixed the gate again, says it'll hold this time. She's strong, just like her mother was. She closed the book and pressed it to her chest. When she stepped out into the morning, the light was beginning to break through the clouds, pale and uncertain, but they're all the same. Kade was tightening the saddle straps, his movements practiced and sure. He looked up when she approached, one brow raised. Ready? She nodded. Let's go. And they rode out together past the broken trees and carved out earth, toward the hills that still stood unchanged. The trail wound slow through the hills, softened by the rain, the horses' hooves leaving long prints in the damp earth. Della kept her gaze forward, shoulders straight despite the ache in her spine. The mare beneath her moved steady, her breath visible in the cool morning air. Kade rode a half-length ahead, reins loose in his left hand, his right brushing against the rifle tied to the saddle. He hadn't spoken much in the last mile, and she hadn't pushed him to. There was a rhythm to the ride that didn't ask for words. They crested a rise, and he pulled up, lifting a hand to signal her to stop. She eased the mare beside him and followed his gaze. Below, a narrow pasture stretched out, ringed by low pines. A few cattle grazed close to the edge of a shallow pond. The fence along the north line had collapsed, likely under the weight of runoff, but the animals had stayed close. Kade exhaled slow through his nose. Could have been worse. Della nodded. They held together. He dismounted and handed her his reins. Watch the horses. She took them without question as he moved down the slope toward the cattle. He walked quiet, boots sinking into soft ground, and the herd lifted their heads at his approach but didn't scatter. She watched as he inspected their legs, checked for limps, ran a hand over a heifer's flank. It struck her then how sure he was on his feet, how he didn't rush. He treated each animal like it mattered, not with fuss, but with care baked into every motion. When he returned, wiping mud from his hands with a strip of old cloth, she asked, "You always work this land alone?" He shrugged. "Most days. There's a fella comes by in fall to help with branding, but otherwise it's just me." "You ever get tired of the quiet?" He met her eyes. "Sometimes, but I'd rather hear wind through the grass than a man's voice saying nothing useful." She smiled faintly. "That sounds like something my father would have said." They rode along the edge of the pasture, toward the broken fence. Kade dismounted again and examined the damage, then pulled a coil of wire from his saddlebag. "You're fixin' it now?" she asked, surprised. "Best to keep the cattle from wandering. Won't take long." She slid off the mare and knelt beside him. "Let me help." He didn't argue, handed her the end of the wire and showed her how to loop it around the bent post. Their fingers brushed once, not on purpose, but neither of them pulled back. She felt the warmth of his skin even through the chill. "You always knew how to mend things?" she asked as she tightened the loop. Didn't have much choice. He twisted another length into place. My folks died when I was 16. Left me and my brother just a few acres and a barn full of debt. She paused, looking over. He left for Denver not long after, Kate continued. Said he wanted a life that didn't smell like manure and pine pitch. So it was just you then. He nodded. Figured if I stayed quiet and worked honest, maybe the land would give back what it owed. Della pressed the wire flat against the post. Did it? Not always, he said. But sometimes. Like when I find a calf born strong or the roof holds through a storm. They worked until the fence stood again, patched but steady. By then, the sun had pushed through the clouds, casting long light through the trees. Cade stood, brushing his hands together. You hungry? She straightened, surprised to realize her stomach had started to twist with emptiness. A little. There's a spring not far from here. Clean water, good shade. We can eat there. They led the horses through the trees, where the ground sloped down to a patch of mossy rock. Cade pulled a cloth bundle from his saddlebag and unwrapped dried venison and a heel of bread. He handed her half without ceremony. They ate in silence, the spring gurgling nearby. Della sat with her back against a fallen log, watching sunlight flicker through the leaves overhead. You ever think of leaving this place? She asked after a while. Selling off the land, starting somewhere new? He chewed slowly, then swallowed. I've thought about it, but I reckon I'd miss the way the air smells after rain. The way the hills look bare until you get close enough to see what's growing. She nodded. There's comfort in what you know. He looked at her, steady. You could stay. She froze, half a breath caught in her throat. I'm not saying you have to, he added, voice even. But if you wanted to, this cabin's got room. The land could use another set of hands. She laid the crust of bread in her lap, fingers curling around it. What would that look like? He didn't answer right away. It'd look like mornings with coffee and silence. Days fixing what needs fixing. Nights with the fire burning low. And maybe, he added quieter, something better than lonesome for both of us. She looked down at her hands. I don't want to be a burden, she said. You're not. The words settled between them, simple and unshaken. I don't know how to stop missing them, she whispered. You don't need to. He shifted closer, close enough she could feel the warmth of him. But you can carry them with you into something new. If you want to. She turned her head, met his eyes. There was no pity there, only a quiet offering. She didn't speak, just reached for his hand. He closed his fingers around hers, slow and certain, and neither of them let go. By the end of that week, the rhythm between them had settled into something quiet and capable. Mornings began with the groan of the stovepipe warming. The scent of coffee beans cracked beneath the heel of his hand. Della rose with the sun now, not because she had to, but because the stillness before the work began felt like a place she could breathe. She helped with the smaller tasks, gathering kindling, shaking out the rugs, tending to the hens that had wandered onto the land from a neighbor's place and never left. Cade didn't watch her work, but he noticed things. When she nailed a loose shutter back into place, he left an extra set of gloves by the door the next morning. When she sorted the seed sacks without asking, he brought down 2 oil lamps from the attic and handed her one with a quiet, for when you're reading. Late one afternoon, the sky turned copper-colored with dust blowing off the ridgeline. They were hauling firewood from the pine stand, and Della paused to wipe the grit from her cheek with the back of her wrist. You ever think about planting an orchard? She asked, resting a hand on the wagon rail. He glanced at her, then at the grove of bare cottonwoods near the creek bed. Soil's poor right there, but up near the barn? Could hold apples, maybe plums. She nodded. My mother used to press cider in the fall. Said the smell of it was better than any church hymn. Kade chuckled, low in his throat. Sounds like she had the right of it. They worked until the wagon was full. As they turned for home, the horses moving slow beneath the weight, she sat beside him on the bench seat. The sun was dipping low, casting a long gold light across the hills, and the dust had settled into a soft haze. "Kade," she said, not looking at him. What made you come after me that day? Not just because you heard. I mean, you could have sent word, or waited to see if I made it out." He didn't answer right away. The reins in his hands shifted as he guided the team around a rut in the trail. "I lit out before I even finished tying my boots," he said. Didn't stop to think much on it. She turned to him. "But why?" He kept his eyes ahead. "Because every time I thought about you alone in that valley, your voice gone from the world, I felt like the ground had opened under me." The wagon creaked as they rolled on, but her breath stilled. "I didn't know you felt that way," she said, quiet. "I didn't know how to say it then," he replied. "I wasn't sure it would matter." "It matters." His jaw shifted, but he didn't speak again until they reached the split rail fence near the barn. He set the brake and turned to her, the light dying in his eyes but something steadier there now. "You could rebuild somewhere else," he said. "You could go to Cheyenne or farther. Carry your name to a place where no one knows how you lost what you had." "I could," she agreed. "But if you stay," he continued, "it wouldn't be just helping with chores or keeping a roof patched. It'd be your home too. Your say in everything that grows here." Della stepped down from the wagon and looked out across the pasture. The land wasn't lush, not the kind to make a man rich, but there was steadiness in the way the hills held the wind, in the way the grass had started pushing through the flood-soaked soil. "My family's gone," she said, her voice even. "But I'm still here, and I think that has to mean something." He nodded. She turned to face him. "If I stay, it's not out of grief. It's because I want to build something new, with someone who knows what it means to lose, and still chooses to plant trees anyway." Kade stepped down beside her, his boots meeting the packed dirt with quiet certainty. "I'd build that with you," he said. The wind stirred the edge of her sleeve. She reached for his hand, and this time it wasn't for comfort, it was for promise. They stood there as the sun slipped behind the ridge, the last light catching on the horses' manes and the edge of the barn roof. No fanfare, no vows spoken aloud. Just two people who had survived the worst kind of ending, choosing clear-eyed and steady what came next. And what came next would be theirs. The first snow came early that year, a soft ribbon of white trailing across the hilltops before slipping quietly into the valley. Della stood outside the cabin, sleeves rolled to her elbows despite the bite in the air, hands sunk into a sack of cracked corn meant for the hens. A curl of her hair had come loose from its braid, brushing her cheek with each gust. Kade stepped out from the barn, arms streaked with sawdust, a plank tucked under one arm. "Chickens going broody again? They keep sitting on rocks," she said, smiling faintly. "I don't have the heart to tell them nothing's coming of it." "I reckon they'll figure it out," he said, setting the plank beside the porch. "Takes some of us longer than others." She brushed her hands clean and crossed the yard, stopping near the step where he stood. "You finished the stall door? Just needs hinges. I'll ride into town for them next week." She nodded. "Take the list for sugar and kerosene?" He reached into his back pocket, pulling out a folded scrap. "Already written down. You trust me not to come back with licorice instead of lamp oil?" "I trust you to do your best," she said. He looked at her, something quiet and amused in his eyes. "You still thinkin' about teaching?" "Not thinkin'," she said. "Decided." The schoolhouse in Willow Ford's been shuttered 2 winters now. They say it just needs a new roof and someone willing to keep a fire lit through the cold months. He wiped his palms on his trousers. "You planning to ride that far every day come snow?" I'm planning to ask if the church will let me stay in the parson's room during the week. It's not much, but it has a stove. Kade nodded slowly. You're sure? I want to do something with what's still in me, she said. Something that counts past my own walls. You always had a mind for that. They stood a moment longer, the wind tugging at the bare branches behind them. Then she reached for his hand, rough and warm from work. I'll be home on Saturdays, she said. Every week. He didn't answer right away, just turned her hand over in his and ran his thumb along the ridge of her knuckles. I'll make sure the fire's going when you walk in. That night, they sat by the stove, a bowl of dried apples between them, boots off, her feet tucked beneath his legs for warmth. She was sewing a patch into the cuff of his shirt, her needle steady despite the dim light. He was carving a block of pine into something that hadn't yet taken shape, but she could see the beginnings of a curve, the suggestion of wings. You never told me why you carve birds, she said, not looking up. He paused, turning the shape in his hand. Because they don't carry what they lost. Just keep flying. She nodded, pulling the thread tight. You think we're like that now? He looked at her. We're learning to be. A week later, she rode out with the rising sun, bundled in wool, clutching a tin box of chalks and slates. He watched her until she vanished behind the ridge, then turned back toward the barn with the steady gait of a man who'd chosen patience. When Saturday came, she returned covered in coal soot and chalk dust, her cheeks pink from wind, and he met her at the door before she dismounted. There's stew on, he said, and hot bread. She leaned into his chest, closing her eyes. I missed you. He kissed her temple. I missed you more. By spring, the orchard was planted. 5 saplings spaced along the fence line, their branches new and tentative. Della kept a ledger of their growth in her father's old journal, her handwriting neat and hopeful beside the faded ink of his. The townsfolk passed word about the woman who'd reopened the schoolhouse. They said she was strict but fair, and that she read aloud from books with a voice that made the children sit up straighter. They said she rode home every week to a man who waited without asking her to be anything but what she was. One Sunday, after the last frost had broken and the hens began laying again, Kade brought in a crate of fresh eggs and set them beside her on the table. I was thinking, he said, about building a second room. She folded the cloth she'd been hemming. For guests. For us, he said. For when the time comes that there's more than just us. She looked at him, then down at the folded fabric in her lap. I'd like that, she said. He touched her jaw, tilting her chin gently. You sure? I've never been more certain of anything. They married the following month, beneath a cottonwood near the edge of the pasture, with only the wind and the creek bearing witness. She wore linen, pale blue, and he wore his best shirt, the one she'd mended by firelight. There were no vows read from paper, just his hands around hers and the words they'd both waited long enough to say. That night, as the fire burned low and the saplings rustled faintly in the wind, he held her with the same quiet care he'd shown from the first day. And she folded into him like something that had finally found its place. Years passed. The school grew. The orchard bore fruit. The cabin stretched with new walls, a second room, a cradle carved by his hand. They weathered dry summers and hard winters, sickness and joy. The years carved into the lines at the corners of their eyes. But never once did the fire go out when she came home. And never once did he forget how it felt to find her on that ridge, mud-soaked and broken, and how even then he'd known. This was the life he'd been waiting for, and she was the heart of it.